Good morning, guys. Good morning. Today's Tuesday, November 17th, 2015, and it's approaching 8:30 in the morning. I've been up a couple of hours now. I woke up thinking about some of the world events that has been happening. For example, the terrorist attacks in Paris, France. My condolences to the victims, the people who got killed, the innocent bystanders who were in cafes, who were in soccer stadium, etc. You had even Americans that were killed in this attack. So my condolences to the loved ones of these people. My listening to the news, I had a lot of emotions that followed. On the surface, you see, modern day people who are caught in the crossfire of this violence, senseless violence. And as you know, violence begets more violence. I wanted to stop. Then I started asking myself, why is this happening? I come from a French background. My mother's people are from Martinique. It's an island in the Caribbean. It's an overseas department of France. I've been to Martinique twice, 2 weeks each time, and I sensed tension in the air when I was there. My last visit was about 16, 17 years ago. And then prior to that, it was 10 years from that time. But I saw in both visits tension amongst the people. Martinique is an island where you have people, the mass majority of the people are of African ancestry. These were the descendants of people who were enslaved by the French government. And even though Martinique now is a modern city, you have cute little cafes, you have grocery stores that has fine products, what we would call in New York high-end products. The prices there were extremely, extremely high. But what I remember, a man there, he was an older gentleman. At that time he was, I think, in his 70s. A light-skinned person, someone of African and European ancestry, and he worked at a store, an ice cream store. And then out of the blue, he mentions, oh, the French, they're just trying to pacify us. And I was surprised to hear that sentiment. And back then, I was thinking, that was my first visit. But I was thinking, oh, well, this is part of what they call, what America would call Latin America. And everybody in Latin America, they're all Latins. They, black and whites and mixed race people. Everybody's one. That's what they want you to think. But when I was there was a deep undercurrent of anger and resentment that even though they are, in essence, Europeanized, they were angry at their situation. Well, what we do know with Martinique, the rest of the Caribbean, and all of Latin America, that it has a very, very, very violent history. It was under slavery of the African, slavery of the indigenous pre-Columbian people, and an enforcement. Those who survived, they were forced to change their language and religion as we see today. But for the Americas' history upon European invasion, from the 1400s, late 1400s, till now, you had people who were being kidnapped, beaten, were forcibly put on ships, pirating, overseas. These victims thrown overboard when another ship, what they call a policing ship, came to investigate the cargo aboard their ship, and to cover the evidence, human beings were thrown overboard. You had Indians who are called Indians, and they were given smallpox. They the Europeans took blankets and contaminated it with smallpox viruses on it. And then they handed it to these populations in the Americas to kill them. Wouldn't you call those events terrorism? Terrorism. What is that word? What does that word mean? It's to frighten in order to control and subjugate. But you first frighten them to destabilize them. And then one by one, you systematically remove their power from them, and then you control and master over them. During the time of slavery in the Americas, these terrorists, as I call them, wanted you to call them master. Sounds familiar? Master and slave. So the slave, so-called slave, gets a label that disempowers him or her, that status, rather than someone who is being victimized and the victimizer. So when you read history books about these events from the time of Columbus on up to like the 1800s, you're removed from thinking about what really went on for these several hundred years. What was going on in the Americas was terrorism. Terrorism in its horrific sense, in every sense of the word. Men, women, children, elderly, you name it, all of them were put into situations of severe trauma that was lived from generation to generation. But now you don't have formalized slavery or the type of kidnapping, but now you have still migration. I forget the term that they use, but you have people being sent to the Americas, or I should say people even being brought to North America for their cheap labor, forced to live in crammed environments. I think this too is to destabilize ethnic communities, I should say specifically black communities in North America. And they did the same thing in the Caribbean after formalized slavery. The Caribbean had a new influx of immigrants from other parts of the world, primarily from Asia. And you did have some from the islands off the coast of Africa and Europe. And they were sent also to the Caribbean for cheap labor, and then to destabilize the victims of this terrorism that was put upon them in the form of slavery. Imagine this. Here you have television cameras, social media, the internet in our modern world that photographs, tapes, all these current events, such as the bombing in France. You know, the people put bombs on their body and then blew themselves up. They had weapons, guns, were shooting people at random. And we call it what it is, terrorism. But now let's take those cameras and social media and bring it back in time to the time of Columbus, to the time of Napoleon, and shine it on these people called Indians, called the African savage. What do you see? Okay. Now, let's say somehow these so-called savages from Africa, or the indigenous people called Indians, let's say somehow someone gave them weapons, a weapon such as the gun, or a large supplies of bows and arrows. Let's say they learned what they call guerrilla warfare, like what was practiced in Vietnam. You had the indigenous people who were tenacious and they did not want the French to oppress them anymore. They had underground caves and networks, and they fought off their oppressors. Let's say that technology was brought to the Americas for these people to have, the Indian or the African. Let's say they fought back and put the European, in to destabilize them. What would that look like? Let's say you have a plantation that has slaves in the Caribbean or North America or South America, etc., who got these weapons and then attacked their oppressors' homes or their stores. They came with, if let's say they had guns and machetes and, sophisticated weapons of the day, and they knew how to use them. And then they started closing in on their oppressors' interests, their plantations, lighting fires to the plantations and their so-called mansions. What would that look like with the camera, modern day camera, or social media? And then these Europeans or white people had television and the news was reporting. Wouldn't they as well say, hey, this is terrorism. Our plantations are being burned down. Our children being ravaged. we're being chopped up to death, we're being shot at, etc., etc. These white people would be crying out, hey, we're being terrorized. Why are they doing this why are they doing this to us? And then they call these people, Africans, black people, Native Americans, Indians, whatever what you want to call them. When did these Europeans or white people call them terrorists? And why this is happening to them? History tells us exactly what happened to these Indians and Africans or black people. They were victimized, tortured, in order to submit to their oppressors. Now let's fast forward to modern times. What's happening in what we call the Middle East? The Middle East also was colonized by the same Europeans. And you had Muslims there, but I never heard of them revolting against the European. You have all of North Africa, it's mostly, the French took over North Africa and, of course, a lot of West Africa. You even had Napoleon invading Egypt and other parts of the Middle East. These parts of the world were Europeans' playground of wickedness, for wickedness. And the people, the indigenous people living there, were at their whim. They couldn't do anything. And then you have what was discovered oil, black gold, that's now used as fuel. And now this industrialized European nations are dependent on this source of energy. And again, as a back note, that slaves was a type of black gold of energy for the European. Or labor is energy. Just a correlation. So now these nations in the Middle East are being invaded still by these Europeans. And you never heard of jihad? Never. During the colonialism of these areas in North Africa and the Middle East. But now, they're waking up. They are starting to fight back against their European/white oppressor. Now they have weapons. They're being funded bombs, rifles, and a lot of them are being funded by Western nations, as they call it. Anytime you hear the word Westerner, just replace it with the word white people or white person. Like Al-Qaeda was formed by white people for their interests initially. These Al-Qaeda was funded by Europeans, white people, to destroy each other, to destroy other Europeans who were in the way of Western European interests. These Middle Eastern people still have the weapons that were given to them. At first they were called heroes, maybe, because they were working on our behalf. And now they're saying, you know, I want to free my people. I want to free our interests. I want to benefit from our black gold. I want to set up a government that supports the people, not to privatize the oil, the black gold, but it's going to be owned by the people, the native people of that land where that black gold comes from. And then all of a sudden, you get resistance. And never before, you know, in colonialism, that you had a so-called religious war. They were religious back then, but no fighting. But now, these people are fighting. And they're fighting now because their resources are being taken. And they don't want this anymore. So now they're fighting any way they know how. But when they do it, the Western world, as there are like a euphemism, Western world, it's another term for white people. Now they're saying, hey, why is this happening to us? Why are you killing us? Why are you bombing us? And these Westerners, the governments behind them, are acting like they're victims. Clearly they are victims. You know, the regular population. But the government, the corporations that are really behind it and are being supported by the government, but they put the label terrorism upon these people. So now they're bad people. And they wonder why this is happening. I see what's happening. And as ugly as it might sound, that the chickens are coming home to roost. That the people that were the true terrorists are now experiencing what it feels like to be slapped back. These Western societies need to learn how to humble themselves. These corporations that are behind this whole wickedness, that are exploiting human labor and their resources. There's a history of everything, why things are happening. But the only difference now is that the victim is now being empowered. The former victim from the past is now outnumbering these so-called Westerners. They have more children. Europeans aren't having as many children anymore. So now when you look in North America, the large cities, they're overwhelmingly people of color. And Europe, Western Europe in particular, and Central Europe, are now being, their cities, now filled with people from the former colonies, former places that they got slaves from, or places where they took their exploited their resources. Now they're flooding these towns in Europe, and they, generally, have more children. And Europeans are no longer having children, not as much. I mean, the growth rate, that it's like zero growth. That as many people are born are as many people who are dying. So there's no population growth with these Europeans. Things are changing. and changing very quickly. And I feel all these things that are happening with these new so-called new terrorists, that it's all by design. And yes, I sense that something very serious is going to happen globally. But this, what I say, to stay calm, to be prayerful, to know that everything you see is by design, but to keep your spirituality and pray for insight and spiritual direction, because they want you to fight back, to do things so that the system could make an excuse and take more and more of your natural rights away. A police state. I see it coming. So that's all I really have to say for now. I pray for world peace, and peace through love and not war. We are each other's brother and sister, and I wish no harm on any human being. Please feel free to comment below, to share this audio tape with your friends or family. You can also subscribe to my channel, and once again, to give me the thumbs up. Peace to you all.